Hello, I am PJ Capozzi, the new superintendent for Oregon CUSD 220. Each year, I'll put together a fiscal year budget presentation so that the board, the staff, and the community can have some more in-depth understanding of what is taking place financially within the district. The first thing that we have to do in anything when it comes to the budget is understand how we get more money. Schools are unique in the fact that no matter how well you do, your success does not dictate your revenue, which is unlike almost any other business or corporation. For us, there are three primary sources of revenue. That is the local property tax, which anyone listening to this most likely feels a couple times a year when that payment comes out. State funding, which is now called evidence-based funding in the state of Illinois, and federal money, which almost always comes by the way of grants. With these primary sources of revenue, it's important to understand that we really have direct influence over one of them, and that is local property tax revenue. And I say influence, not control, because as a school district, we do not control the assessed value of the property within our school district, and nor do we have the ability to dictate the rate of which we use to determine how we get money in. For the vast majority of the elements of our budget, that rate is controlled by statute. Now, we could change it through a referendum, but that's a large, complicated process. So for the sake of understanding how we budget, the majority of the elements of how we secure tax payment is capped, where there's a ceiling as to what we can request. So we don't really have absolute control. We simply have influence. Here's the key data that I want everyone to understand. Last year, we ran a deficit budget, and those numbers look alarming, but from my understanding and analysis of the previous year's budgets, it really isn't as bad as it seems. This is largely a mechanism of we received funding for a large project in fiscal year 23, completed that budget in fiscal year 24. So fiscal year 24 looks way out of whack, but when you combine the 2 years, it's a much more stable picture. As you can see, at the end of fiscal year 24, these are unaudited numbers, so they will switch, but probably very slightly. We have about $16 million in the bank and $13 million in our operating fund. The operating fund, from a logistical standpoint for me as a superintendent, is a much more important number. The operating funds are where we spend money out of for salaries, for all things that directly impact education. The other funds are used for things like large projects, safety protocol issues, helping support retirement funding that we're compelled to do so by the state, but they're not funds that we use on a daily basis. You will see that we also are projecting a deficit for this year, for fiscal year 25, which I will explain in just a second. So we're expecting a deficit for three primary reasons. The first, corporate personal property replacement tax, which is a mouthful to say. The revenue projections from last year to this year for our district projected to be down about $500,000. CPPRT is a very complex formula. Again, one that we have literally, in this case, no influence over. We just get a report from the Illinois Department of Revenue every year telling us what we can expect to budget. And so they just informed us, actually in August after the fiscal year started, that we can project a $500,000 decrease in that funding. The second is that we had to make a repayment to IRS. We took advantage of some COVID funding that we were not able to as a public entity and had to pay that back. And we had a small miscalculation in terms of FICA, which is a flow-through payroll deduction that comes directly from us as the employer to the IRS on behalf of employees that we had to rectify. Additionally, as you have seen in multiple communications from the district, we are very excited about an interactive whiteboard project that we completed this year. I approved that and worked with Dr. Mahoney last year. It was intended to be on last year's budget, but a large chunk of it did not fall into last year's budget, so we ended up having to pay for it on this year's budget. All of those things lead to a deficit budget in fiscal year 25. On the expenditure side, it is a much more scientific process than the revenue. So I like to say that we control expenditures, we don't control revenue. And in many cases, we can be pretty close with being precise in terms of what we're going to do for expenditures. This is because salaries, so for instance, administration and teachers, are kind of carved in stone. We know exactly what we're going to pay on those things. And then when we allocate money for things like supplies or textbooks, we do so in a very controlled manner, saying you have X amount of dollars, and we work very hard to stay within that budget. Now, there are some things we can't control, things like energy costs, emergencies, collateral issues that we could not project when the year goes. So the budget is not an exact science, even though the expenditure side of it is more scientific than the revenue side. Another key element to understand when we're talking about the annual budget is the tax rate. As you can see from this graph, it is pretty telling that the Board of Education has worked hard over time to control and to decrease the tax rate when possible. For those of you that are listening to this, you might say, the tax rate must not have gone down. I'm paying more in my taxes than ever before. It's important to understand that tax rate is a function of two things: the value of your property and the tax rate. In addition, there are many other taxing bodies that are impacting each community member beyond just the school district. That can include municipal fire and police, city, county, etc. So as I stated before, the area that we have the most influence in terms of determining what our revenue looks like is the tax rate. And as you can see, the board has been very conscious in not increasing that beyond what is necessary to have a healthy budget for the district. I think it's also good to understand where we are at comparatively. So when we publish a budget, it is important to understand it always feels like there's a lot of money going to education. And it is. It's the largest thing that most property owners are taxed on in the vast majority of communities in the state of Illinois. But there is kind of a central clearinghouse that we can tell if we're being overtaxed, or if the district is spending too much money, or whatever that happens to look like. We can analyze that. So what you're seeing here is publicly available data on the Illinois Report Card, which looks at the unit districts in Ogle County, with the exception of Rochelle. Rochelle is not a unit district. And it compares how we're spending money to educate our kids on the instructional side compared to everybody else. And as you can see, the county kind of writ large spends considerably less than the state average, but also performs at a level that is very much at or near the state average. But then when you look within the county itself, you can see that for many years here, Oregon has spent the least amount of instructional money per pupil, and in this case, it's very near the bottom. So I just like to share this because I believe it's a good demonstration that I can provide to the community to understand that the district is not being frivolous with the money, does not have a spending problem, and we are doing the best with the revenue we have to provide the best possible education for our students. With that said, thank you for taking the time to listen to this. Hopefully it's been 9 minutes well spent for you. If you have any questions, you can contact me at my email address or my personal cell. Thank you very much, and make it a great day.